All right, welcome. Today we're going to jump right into a text that, wow, it really takes on some of the biggest ideas out there about God and the universe. We're going to break down how this source just completely challenges what a lot of us think and offers up a radically different way of looking at things. So let's get into it.
So let's just start with the biggest question of all, right? The one this text really digs into. What is God's true role in the universe? Is God a micromanager tweaking every little thing? Or maybe a distant creator who just set things in motion and walked away? A judge keeping score? This one question, it's really at the heart of everything we're about to unpack.
Well, according to the text we're looking at, the answer is, it's a lot bigger and honestly, a lot stranger than most of us are used to. It's a perspective that kind of yanks us out of our small familiar world and, boom, throws us into this huge cosmic way of thinking.
Okay, so here's our game plan. First, we're going to tackle the sheer scale of God's purpose. Then, we'll reframe a couple of massive concepts, divine providence and nature. After that, we're going to challenge that old idea of an emotional human-like God. And finally, we'll get into how this text says we can actually realize God in our own lives. Sound good? Let's dive in.
All right, first up, get this. The core idea here is that God's ultimate plan isn't just big, it's fundamentally unknowable to us. And that's a huge place to start, right? Because it kind of suggests that a real spiritual journey doesn't begin with having all the answers. It begins with a little humility.
And the source doesn't mess around with this. It says flat out that the eternal purpose is so immense that even super high-level celestial beings can't fully wrap their heads around it. So think about what that means for us. The implication is crystal clear. Our human understanding, it's just a tiny, tiny piece of an infinitely bigger puzzle.
Okay, so if the big picture, the grand plan is a mystery, what does that mean for the day-to-day stuff? God's involvement in the universe right now. And that brings us to this massive concept, divine providence. A lot of people think of that as, direct intervention, God stepping in to change things. But this text, it lays out a completely different model.
But before we tear that old idea down, let's get our terms straight. The text here describes providence not as random acts of magic, but as this huge interconnected system, like a cosmic web of divine activities, all working together within the laws of the universe. So think of it less like a one-off miracle, and more like this gigantic, orderly process that's always pushing towards spiritual growth.
And this really highlights the difference, doesn't it? That common idea of, let's be honest, kind of childish intervention like helping you find your car keys or win the lottery, that gets thrown out. And it's replaced with this consistent, universal plan of progressive evolution. The source is really firm on this. True providence never gets in the way of human progress. It actually works with it. It's all about evolution, not sudden intervention.
So what's the big takeaway here? It's that God isn't some distant clockmaker who wound up the universe and just left. Nope. The text describes a constant, active upholding of everything. I mean, literally, without this continuous sustaining force, the universe will just, poof, collapse. This is a very active God, not a passive one.
All right, let's shift gears. Let's talk about nature. You hear it all the time, right? God's creation, divine handiwork, when you look at a beautiful sunset or a mountain range. But this text comes in and asks a really tough question. Is what we see out there, is it really a perfect picture of a perfect God? So here's how the source breaks it down. What we call nature is actually a combination of two cosmic factors. First, you've got the absolute perfection and unchanging reality of God. Think of it like a perfect blueprint. But then, and this is key, you have the second factor, all the incomplete, imperfect, evolving creatures and forces trying to execute that blueprint. So nature ends up being this messy, beautiful, and sometimes really flawed result of those two things clashing.
Yeah, you can almost think of it like a simple equation. You take absolute perfection and you divide it by cosmic incompletion. And what do you get? Nature, a mix of incredible majesty and, let's face it, brutal flaws. Both order and chaos, all wrapped up together.
And this leads to a pretty stunning conclusion in the text. Because of this mix, nature itself can never be a truly accurate portrait of God. It's more like a distorted, incomplete picture. So, according to this view, to worship nature is to worship a flawed, unfinished reflection, not the perfect reality that's behind it all.
Okay, this next one. This one gets really personal. It takes on something we humans do all the time. We project our own emotions onto God, and I'm talking especially about our negative emotions.
I mean, just think about it for a second. For thousands of years, so many belief systems have painted this picture of a God who gets angry, who feels jealous, who demands things to be appeased. It's a really powerful image, and honestly, it's often an image based on fear.
But the source text just comes in and pushes back against this hard. It says that emotions like wrath and jealousy are utterly foreign to God's perfect nature. It even calls them mean and despicable. The whole idea of a God who messes up and then has to repent, gone, replaced with an all-wise, all-powerful being. And that ancient concept of needing to appease an offended God through sacrifice, completely thrown out.
And this quote, wow, this is probably one of the most powerful statements in this whole section. It calls the very idea of shedding innocent blood to win God's favor an affront, an insult, based on what it calls a fictitious divine wrath. I mean, that's a total rejection of some of the most ancient foundational ideas you find in early human religions.
So, okay, if God isn't angry and we don't need to appease this fictitious wrath, then how do we connect with the divine? That's the million-dollar question, right? And that's exactly what our final section is about, the path to realizing God that this text lays out.
And the source makes a really critical shift right here. It says the path to God isn't paved with fear, it's paved with love. God is presented as a universal Father, and the entire relationship is based on divine sentiment, on love. So what does that mean for us? It means the best way to connect isn't through some rigid ritual or trying to just think your way there. It's through the personal, living experience of faith.
And this final quote really ties it all together, doesn't it? The idea is that in this world, which we've already established is imperfect and full of struggle, the one thing that gives us the power to overcome all of it is our faith. That personal, deep-down conviction that a piece of that perfect, loving Father actually lives inside each of us.
Okay, so let's do a quick recap of these huge reframes. We went from a simple, knowable plan to a grand, mysterious purpose. We went from random, divine intervention to a consistent, progressive evolution. We went from seeing nature as a perfect portrait of God to seeing it as a flawed, unfinished reflection. And, maybe most importantly, we went from an angry, jealous judge to a consistently loving Father.
And that leaves us with one last big thought to chew on. If all this is true, if we're living in a universe that is part of a slow, messy, imperfect evolutionary plan, and not a series of perfectly micromanaged events, what does that mean for our lives? How does that change the way we look at purpose versus accident on our own personal journey? It's a huge question, and it's one this material really leaves us to think about. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer.